Welcome back to the NAPAICC Insider podcast. Today, we are talking about a claim that started exactly the way thousands of property insurance claims start every year. A policyholder reports a plumbing-related water loss. Water damage is found. The carrier investigates, and then the denial letter arrives. The reason? A familiar one. Constant or repeated seepage or leakage occurring over a period of 14 days or more. If you've been around property insurance long enough, you already know this movie. It usually comes with the same supporting language. The observed conditions are consistent with long-term exposure. There it is, the magic phrase, consistent with, which is insurance speak for, we have a theory, and we're hoping nobody asks too many questions. Now let's be clear. This claim was not really about whether damage existed. It was not about whether water was present. It was not about whether the property needed repairs. This claim came down to one issue: time. And when a carrier applies a time-based exclusion, they need time-based proof, not impressions, not assumptions, not a visual opinion dressed up in technical language. Proof. Because if the policy says the exclusion applies only when seepage or leakage occurs over 14 days or more, then the carrier has to prove the condition exceeded 14 days. That should not be complicated, but apparently common sense now requires a formal introduction. Most denied claims go wrong because people respond emotionally. The homeowner says, "That's not true." The contractor says, "We disagree." The representative says, "This should be covered." And while all of that may be understandable, it usually does not move the file. Because coverage is not decided by who is most offended. Coverage is decided by the policy, the facts, and what can actually be proven. So instead of just arguing with the denial, we did something different. Simple questions. The kind of questions that should already have answers if the denial is legitimate. When did the moisture intrusion begin? What methodology was used to determine duration? Was any forensic material dating performed? Was the substrate deterioration analyzed for timeline progression? Were corrosion patterns, mineral deposits, or material conditions evaluated? Was any allocation made between damage occurring within the first 14 days and damage occurring after 14 days? What engineering analysis supports the duration conclusion? And most importantly, where is the proof required to apply the exclusion? That question matters, because the carrier does not get to simply point at damage and say, "Looks old." That is not adjustment. That is a guess with a claim number attached to it. And once those questions were asked, something very interesting happened. Silence. Not because the carrier did not want to respond, because the file did not contain the answers. The denial was not built on a timeline. It was not built on forensic analysis. It was not built on engineering. It was built on assumption. An assumption is not enough to deny a claim under a time-based exclusion. Now let's talk about another major problem in this file. The carrier's position relied on a retained hygienist. A hygienist can absolutely play an important role in a water or mold claim. A hygienist can identify microbial growth. A hygienist can evaluate environmental conditions. A hygienist can recommend remediation protocols. That is their lane, and that lane matters. But determining when moisture began, determining how long structural materials were wet, establishing a timeline tied directly to a policy exclusion, that is not the same thing. That moves into forensic and engineering territory. So when a carrier uses a hygienist to support a duration-based exclusion, we have to ask a very basic question. Is the expert actually qualified to prove the fact being used to deny the claim? Because if the issue is mold presence, call a hygienist. If the issue is moisture duration, material degradation, and timeline analysis, then you need someone qualified to address those issues. That is not being picky. That is called using the right tool for the job. You don't use a thermometer to measure roof uplift. You don't use a plumber to interpret policy exclusions. And you don't use a hygienist to prove a forensic moisture timeline unless they actually have the methodology and qualifications to do it. Tiny details, apparently important. At some point, the file reached a level of scrutiny where the carrier had to make a decision. They could either stand on an unsupported denial or support it properly. They chose to support it properly. A licensed engineer was retained. And once that happened, the narrative changed. Same loss, same damage, same policy, same property. But now the file was being evaluated under a higher standard of proof, and that changed everything. The denial was reversed. Coverage was afforded. The claim moved forward into adjustment. Let me say that again, because this is the part people need to understand. Nothing about the damage changed. Nothing about the loss changed. Nothing magical happened at the property. The only thing that changed was the level of proof applied to the denial. That is the lesson. This was not about winning an argument. This was not about being louder than the carrier. This was not about writing an angry email and hoping someone felt bad. This was about enforcing the standard required by the policy. If the carrier wants to apply a 14-day exclusion, then the carrier needs to prove the condition existed for 14 days or more. They do not get to assume duration. They do not get to shift the burden to the insured. They do not get to rely on unsupported conclusions. They do not get to say consistent with and pretend the investigation is complete, because consistent with is not proof. It is a possibility, and possibilities do not trigger exclusions. Facts do. This is the bigger pattern we see over and over again in property claims. Exclusions applied without complete analysis. Conclusions drawn without proper expert support. Burden quietly shifted onto the policyholder. And denial letters written with just enough technical language to make people stop asking questions. That is why so many claims die early, not because the denial is right, because nobody challenges the foundation. Most files stop at, "We disagree." This one did not. This file was challenged with specific, technical, policy-driven questions. And once those questions were asked, the weakness in the denial became obvious. There was no proven timeline. There was no sufficient methodology. There was no proper expert basis to support the exclusion. And when the carrier was forced to actually support the denial collapsed. That is what proper claim representation looks like. Not just estimating damages, not just complaining, not just sending a demand and hoping for the best. It means understanding the policy, understanding the exclusion, understanding the burden, understanding the expert roles, and forcing the claim decision to stand on evidence instead of assumption. So here is the takeaway. If you are dealing with a denied water damage claim, do not just ask whether the carrier denied it. Ask why. Ask what provision they relied on. Ask what facts they used to trigger that provision. Ask whether the expert actually proved the facts required by the policy. Ask whether the denial is based on evidence or assumption, because it is not just about what happened. It is about what the carrier can prove happened. And if they cannot meet that burden, the denial may not hold. Same policy, different outcome. Why? Because the file was built correctly. At NAPAICC Inc., this is why we make written coverage decisions. We do not represent assumptions. We do not represent carrier shortcuts. We represent the policyholder, the policy, and the facts. And when a denial is built on weak reasoning, we do what should have been done from the beginning. We take it apart. If you find this content valuable, please help us get it in front of more people by liking, subscribing, and sharing. We genuinely appreciate your support. If this content is useful to you, please like, subscribe, and share it so we can keep reaching people who need to understand what's really happening. Your support truly helps. I'm Scott Harris with NAPAICC Inc., Florida Public Adjuster License W524910. This has been The Insider. And remember, a carrier does not get to apply a time-based exclusion without proving time. That is not aggressive. That is just reading the policy. A radical concept, apparently.